Good afternoon. My name's Rachel Jaftha. I'm here at the Economics Department at Stellenbosch, and I am your chair for the trade session. I will be very economical with my words so that you'll have the benefit of the presentations by our speakers. It is with great interest that I invite Dave Donaldson from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to do the first presentation, 30 minutes, after which we will have two respondents whom I'll invite at the time when Dave has given us his insights. Please come up.
Thanks. So, yeah, thank you so much for the chance to be here. I'll be talking about the topic I was assigned, which is the word trade, though I think you could probably replace a lot of what I'll say today with firms. So the previous session was a great connection. In fact, you might think that Eric and I were coordinating on our introductions, though I swear we weren't, at least not to my knowledge. So obviously, I'll be speaking about the connections between trade and development. Those connections intellectually have very deep roots. The field of development was often incredibly integrated with trade. I'm told the top departments used to not have a development seminar or a trade seminar, but a trade and development seminar. And that's not true today, to my knowledge, but I'd love to learn about counterexamples. The one thing that's interesting about the topic of trade, however, just to whet your appetite, might be the controversy, the intellectual opinions about, and the fashion, you might say, in policy circles of export-oriented trade strategies, growth strategies versus import substitution strategies has waxed and waned throughout the past, since the post-war era, and that highlights that there's still a lot of intellectual disagreement. You can also think about the anti-globalization protests in Seattle, for example, of the 90s. Those protests actually what got me interested in this. I was studying physics, but then switched to economics at the time. The big thing that I would say has changed recently is the same thing Eric pointed to, which is the empirical revolution that has happened here as much as everywhere else. A couple points of distinction might be that the things I'm going to be talking about today are relatively macro, relatively general equilibrium in the textbook sense of that word, within the space of things we've been covering. We therefore have to use broader notions of quasi-experimental variation than just genuinely randomized variation. There's a theme of using theory, maybe as kind of little as is necessary, and there's an interesting question about how to do that well. But theory to extrapolate as powerfully and robustly as possible from those natural experiments, that's something that I talked about recently in the JEP article, where I walked through kind of a spectrum of 11 examples in the field of spatial economics and sort of the extent to which they're using theory to learn from a reduced form that hopefully is credible. Okay, but I decided I'm going to focus on three particular, zoom in on three areas that I think, where the progress in the last 20 years has been particularly exciting. Obviously, that's my opinion. There's lots of other great progress, too, that I'll talk about at the end. But broadly, just at a very high level, one of these will just be like, let's expand what we mean by the word trade. Second, then just maybe more the trillion-dollar question, which is like, is trade good for growth? I'll give you an update on what we know about that. Think about the impact of trade on aggregate incomes. And then, of course, the next, maybe even more important question might be the impacts on inequality. And in all three of these areas, there's been a huge amount of work in the last 20 years. So in terms of broadening what we think about trade, I'm sure you're used to seeing this picture, maybe this exact picture, because this picture gets used a lot in presentations about trade. I don't want you to think as much about that, even though I'm sure that's fascinating, but more about this. These are two examples of great recent work. Where they're really sort of studying trade both like within countries and across countries as a sort of integrated whole, and they're doing it for much of this continent. One of them is looking at the effects of road upgrading on the continent, throughout the continent. One of them is looking at the effects of kind of arbitrage failure and storage failure across agricultural markets that are connected across and within countries to varying degrees. But this is the kind of image I guess I'd sort of love to have people to have in mind. So actually, being accused of pandering to the Swedes, the Bertil Ohlin, the Nobel Prize-winning Swedish economist, the co-originator of the phrase Heckscher and Ohlin, thinking about trade, little known fact, although maybe it's not so little known, but the title of his book was actually Interregional and International Trade. So he saw this idea of like one unified whole. That intellectual idea has many, many followers and people who've taken it and run with it in fantastic ways. Maybe the work of Paul Krugman is most famous. Obviously the point is that we don't think the trade, international trade, starts or stops at any kind of foreign border. You might also imagine that the greatest amount of globalization that's happened over the last 100 years or something might be happening within countries. That a lot of the technological improvements that have integrated space have been like about domestic transport improvements rather than international transport improvements, as big as the latter have kind of been and been famous for. This might be particularly true in some parts of low-income countries, of course. So, the thing that's really changed in the past 20 years is data availability. Okay, so think about measuring intra-national trade. The trade within South Africa, or the trade within France or England. Amazingly, like about 20 years ago, I was interested in starting my PhD, and I was interested in like, where can we measure such international trade? And one of the few places I could find it was like in the records of the old colonial India office in London, where like the Brits in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan kept track of trade within the country. They actually stopped doing so by about 1920. They didn't think it was worth doing anymore. But there was a window in which we sort of had great visibility. Anyway, now fast forward, that's completely changed. There are many sources of domestic international trade data. Maybe the most prominent is the growth of the VAT, GST kind of microdata. I can count at least 10 low developing countries that for which such microdata is available to researchers. That's growing quickly. You can imagine lots of other creative sources where we're finally getting visibility on trade. I mean, for a science that is fundamentally about exchange, it's kind of nuts that 20 years ago the only bilateral exchanges we had data on, basically, were crossing international borders, because customs agencies were tracking those for 200 years. But the intranational trade, we would have consumption data sets that told you how much people buy and production data sets that told you how much people produce. But the individual bilateral connections between those two things, between firms and consumers and firms, was just never in any data set, basically, until very recently. And I think that has the potential, as was alluded to in earlier sessions, to really transform the way we might think about some issues that matter. There's, of course, other geocoded data, like just basic prices and quantities and wages and things that have, of course, immensely improved as well. Okay, so a natural question is how open are these kind of sub-national economies? I'm going to cite three prominent works in the field of trade here, though these authors might not self-identify as trade economists. I'm going to sort of welcome them into the fold. So for example, Seema's work, Ted's work, just mentioning people who might be in the room. These are amazing papers that do randomized, in case you're not familiar with them, do randomized drops of kind of sometimes supply of goods or things that dramatically shift supply of goods in the middle example, and or just cash to the demand side. And you might say it's amazing at the kind of spatial scale, like in the middle paper, which is in a region of Western Kenya, that kind of even though that picture is only about 20 kilometers tall, they find large price effects of those local supply shocks, right? In fact, those price effects are so big that the authors basically end up with a number that I think you could fairly translate as saying that those villages are 83% of the way to autarky, based on how much a local supply shock affects the local price. It's almost as if they're just isolated. So think about that as evidence for quite closed places. Now the evidence is not as extreme in the other two examples, maybe for reasons that you might expect, but I find it provocative. A more direct attempt to measure this international trade cost stuff is something that David Atkin and I did. So we tried to compare, two African countries with the United States. We found sort of price data for, identical goods, hopefully identical goods, very narrowly defined goods, at all the blue locations every month for many years. In the U.S., the blue locations are everywhere, so I didn't plot them, but just picture them like every zip code, effectively. And if you do enough kind of detective work, you can figure out where those goods are produced or imported from. Those are the purple triangles you can maybe see. And then, of course, there's the road network in the background. But we were interested in the question, fundamental question of like, how big is the cost, call it that trade cost down there, of moving goods from an O to a D, an origin to a destination. And of course, we're interested in the fact that by a sort of basic arbitrage argument, you'd expect that the difference in prices for the same thing, it's on the left of that equation, to be informative, and that's what we can measure in the data. We'd expect that to equal the cost of trading plus the sort of markup on effectively that exchange. Correcting for those markups, the markups aren't of direct interest for this question today, but correcting for those markups is something we developed a way to do via sort of pass-through analysis. But anyway, you end up with an estimate of trade costs that arrives at a figure like the trade costs to the left are kind of somewhere between 5 and maybe even 12 times higher at a scale of 500 kilometers than the trade costs within the United States. So that's the first sort of such estimate of which I was familiar. And again, I find that interesting. Okay, so you might ask, well, what are the real effects of such trade costs on, like, affecting our economies and our efficiencies? So that's where, there's been, for example, a lot of work on things like transportation costs, transportation infrastructure improvements that have plausibly reduced such costs. Not just plausibly, we can sort of try to measure it, and hence plausibly increased trade. Sometimes we can actually measure that, and hence plausibly increased living standards, and sometimes we can try to measure that. And so these are 3 examples, spanning different eras from sort of the colonial era India that I was talking about earlier to, for example, recently in Vietnam, where the question of interest is not so much what was the impact of the roads that were built, but more like, were there better roads that could have been built given that climate change and coastal flooding in the context of Vietnam is imminent and, or in some sense, already here? And so questions like that are rife throughout this literature. Just one example I want to highlight, because I'll come back to it, is Ben Faber's work from China. He was looking not at like urban urban cities in China that did get connected by these lines, but instead at the peripheral rural locations between the cities. And comparing like rural treated to rural not treated, if you like that language, he actually found that the difference was negative. The reduction in GDP per capita in the ones who were like the rural locations that were on the highways was actually negative. So that is, should also sound provocative, right? And I'll come back to that. The study to the bottom right sort of tried to do an exercise comparing welfare effects, obviously very hard to do, fairly model dependent, but trying to do a bit of a horse race between whether these roads that were built in Brazil, sort of you can imagine they changed the mobility of goods, they also changed the mobility of people. This paper sort of tried to quantify the relative effects of that and found as about 3/4 effects were due to trading goods. Okay, so again, pandering to the Swedes, in this case the Swedish ambassador, who 2 days ago told us about Sweden and its dramatic growth. There's a fantastic paper about Swedish railroads to the top right there. That paper actually, by coincidence, has found, I think, the largest estimate of railroads in any context I've ever seen. The estimates are in the ballpark of like a doubling of local real GDP per capita, not evidently driven by reorganization effects that you might expect. But those kinds of things have been done, Germany, US, lots of historical examples. You can imagine railroads were big about 100 years ago, and there's been a lot of work on that. Okay, so I want to just quickly flag that, of course, when we talk about domestic market integration, intranational trade, we have to think more broadly than just like the cost of moving goods. The cost of moving information is important, and other things like electricity are really important too. These are, of course, 2 really famous examples. Robin mentioned the bottom one yesterday. The top 2 are well known. Sort of a particular intervention of like infrastructure rollout, in this case mobile phones, did what we'd expected to in theory, which is quickly, snap the prices to be not that volatile and quite flat and quite equal over space. This is the price of fish. And then there was a sort of another effect of that in terms of reallocation, in terms of quantities, this case in terms of like the allocation of like who produces the boats for the fishermen. That's what's drawn on the right there. The region numbers might not line up, but I think that's because the authors changed the names of the regions across the papers. But anyway, the bottom, of course, as Robin mentioned yesterday, is about sort of 2 regions in Chile or 3 regions that basically integrated their electricity markets through the construction of infrastructure project that was just a grid connection, the ability to move the electricity across the regions. That quickly removed price volatility and snapped prices to be equal across space, as you're seeing on the left. That quickly had quantity effects, which is what we'd expect to have happen if there are efficiency gains in the real world. In this case, the quantity effects are on solar production on the right. Okay, so obviously just stepping back, some implications of that worldview where there are large international trade costs, it raises this question of who's actually exposed to globalization. These are some examples of work that tried to ask that question. It raises questions of like program evaluation, the sort of trade. Obviously, we know that leads to like interacting markets for tradable goods. It's yet another sense in which regions locate, add that to the list, of course, very natural. I've tried to develop with Rick Hornbeck a method that sort of, it's not at all theory-free. Obviously, there's no such thing as a metric of treatment intensity that would be, but this is sort of one inspired by some canonical trade models that we called sort of a measure of kind of market access that basically says you can sort of take the knowledge of how the trade costs are, combine it with a simple model to try to get a measure of treatment intensity that we've used and has been used by others. And I'm sure is largely, very, very wrong and needs dramatically improving. So I highlight that as a major challenge for work on SUTVA violations. Okay, so obviously, the demand side view of kind of constraints on firms and development that has been alluded to earlier has many roots. Those are often sometimes talked about as international and national level issues by, for example, let's think of Penny Tristan's recent work. But of course, those same issues are very much at stake within countries if you think that countries are very subject to very high within country trade costs. This, of course, is in recent work by Tessa and Jakob, who are here, of course. It's very natural to expect that these small markets constrained by trade costs themselves then further issues compound, like the sort of lack of competition that has been highlighted in, for example, this sort of work. Finally, this view of like intranational space or international spatial economics, of course, it goes beyond trade. It massively interacts with like spatial capital mobility, which we've discovered thanks to work like Paula's has its own frictions. It's not like, kind of one completely flat table, to use Dean's metaphor of the water spilling out across the table. There are these frictions, there are these little bumps and valleys. The same as we've learned, and we'll learn a lot more tomorrow in the migration session, is true for labor mobility. The same issues are at stake within urban economics, obviously important and rapidly growing sub-branch of development, surveyed in recent work. And finally, I'd give a shout out to Rob Townsend's Nobel Symposium from 2012 address, where he really sketched this vision of like, not just like village economics, but multi-village economics in Thailand, for example, and the integration of all the markets, labor, capital, goods, etc. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is trade and aggregate incomes. So here, 20, 25 years ago, someone in my shoes would have stood up and talked about the work of Frankel and Romer, a seminal and hugely cited 1999 AER article that was subject to a lot of criticism that was, typical of its time about cross-country, cross-sectional regressions and the challenges of really figuring out what's going on. Two wonderful papers by James Firer really were breakthroughs, in my opinion, on that question, and using that same cross-country variation, now bringing in the panel of countries, looking for reasons why countries trade more over time. So the one on the left is looking at the using as an instrument for trade. That's what the sort of average predicted trade growth thing. I'm showing you just the reduced forms, but the first stage coefficients are roughly 1. The for one on the left is using the rise of air trade as opposed to sea trade. You can imagine some countries' geographies, positions in the globe are like not going to be much affected by the rise of air travel because they're like an island in the middle of nowhere. But that's not at all true for landlocked countries or countries with continents blocking their trade flows by sea, if you like. The one on the right is using a change in the sea shipping technology, the temporary closure for 8 years of the Suez Canal in the 60s. Not many countries were much affected by that. There's only about 8. You can kind of see them labeled. They're affected in one direction by the closing as distance like grows because they have to now go around, the Horn of Africa, etc. And some of them are, and then on the flip side, when the canal reopens, they get a reduction in the distance. But that is correlated with the changes in their GDPs across those episodes. which surprised at least me, I would say. Those effects, I didn't talk about the point estimates, but let me try now to benchmark them. They're really big. Frankel and Romer's estimate shocked the world, and yet the first Fabra paper actually, if anything, was slightly bigger than Frankel and Romer's estimate. You might have thought the cross-section is massively biased up, and the time series would change all that. Of course, it could go the other way, and it kind of did in Fabra's study. But another way to benchmark this is against what canonical models would predict. So, we know that like in an undistorted economy, bear with me, development economists, undistorted economy, but just as a benchmark, imagine undistorted economy, you should be thinking the Holton theorem of 78, which sort of applies an envelope argument to that economy-wide. If everything's efficient, everything's as if it's maximizing GDP. And for open economies, you also need there to be no terms of trade effects, but for smaller countries, we don't think there are probably such things. So in that case, you expect the effects of openness to trade to be just directly how much productivity grew in the trading sector. Maybe shipping technologies doubled in efficiency or tripled in efficiency, but then you multiply it by the extent to which the economy actually uses traded inputs, and those are maybe only a third of the economy. So you kind of multiply that and you get basically a small effect, way, way, way smaller than Fabra. So I did that calculation in a annual review piece, and I estimated that it's somewhere between 4 and 25 times too big in Fabra's estimates. Okay, so there's a domestic economy analog of those statements. So in the India paper I talked about, it's sort of about 2 times too big, the effect of railroads relative to the trade models, or the famous Archelaus, Costanon, Rodriguez-Clare, or ACR formula that really builds on Holton. And then, Faber's negative effect that I said I'd come back to, well, that of course couldn't happen in like an efficient economy. You're like strictly improving the technology. That cannot harm an efficient economy, right? Efficient closed economy. So the fact that it's negative, even in some regions, is really interesting. Okay, so that of course brings us to, but what about distorted economies? So. This is obviously a classic theme in the study of development, the interaction of domestic distortions with trade, both international and intranational. And, a standard result in this literature, maybe I take the pride in having the first equation of the conference, I think, but this is really just an identity, I think if everything's differentiable, this is just an identity. But it sort of says that, like, imagine a small open economy where L, quote unquote, for as if labor is the only factor. There's nothing special about the fact there's only one factor, but I'll do it anyway. It sort of says that the D, welfare D trade, that's on the left, minus whatever the Holton effect is, which is what I said is sort of small and a bit boring, you might think, is all about distortions and reallocation. So I'm sure you know this, but let me just say it anyway. So obviously it's about the covariance between the value marginal product of labor in an activity, like the ith activity. Value marginal product of labor is like if we were to put a little bit more labor into that sector at fixed prices, how much would the price valuation of the quantity that comes out be? That's what the definition of VMPL is. So it's the covariance of VMPL and the treatment effect of trade on the labor in all the I's, right? So obviously, like, this is a fixed labor sort of world. That's why the covariance rather than just the dot product turns up. But the reason for that is, like, you're imagining there's a fixed amount of labor. All you can do is move it around. So you see already that in an undistorted economy, by definition, VMPL, the marginal product of labor, is equalized everywhere. So there would be no covariance of that thing with anything else, right? But of course, in a distorted economy, when the VMPLs do differ, by definition, across activities or space or firms or sectors or whatever, then DLI trade is exactly what you want to know. And it's not just that, but it's the covariance. Like, is trade happening to put the L into the high VMPL sectors or not? Okay, so that's been the study of a lot of recent work, but I want to sort of flag that it is hard, and I don't think there's been as much progress as there needs to be by any stretch. So obviously just getting causal effects of trade on all the LIs in our economy is really hard, because it's like a separate treatment effect for every I. That's already really hard. But then you also have to go out and measure the VMPLs for every activity. That's like you'd have a separate experiment that doses some L into every activity and compares it to a control group, and you know the value marginal product because you do it at constant prices. That's hard too. And then doing the covariance between these things, is like hard squared. So I think that there are like tons of synergies that have already been alluded to, but I can't stress this enough that probably the best field in the world for studying market failures is right here in this room, development economics. It's kind of an identity for our field in many ways. We are estimating those VMPLs all the time. The seminal work of, for example, Demel, Mackenzie, Woodruff, I think in that way. Of course, we'd call VMPK because they did K-drops, but you get my metaphor. And these things, they're a core endeavor. And the interaction of those pre-existing VMPLs with how trade and other things, climate change, whatever you're interested in, happen to change where the L's are in relation to the VMPLs is what it's all about, as we learned from this formula, right? At least what it's all about relative to Hulton. Okay, so that's something that Amit has and my co-author David Atkin and I have tried to sketch some of the possibilities for, and I think it's full of rich possibilities. Okay, so in terms of current progress, I'd highlight the work on informality. If you just sort of believe that informal activities face higher taxes, maybe that's almost a definition of the formal activities face higher taxes, maybe that's a definition, then you have to believe they have higher VMPLs. It just kind of follows. It's as if there's a tax on doing business or hiring labor or both in those activities that's higher in other activities. So if trade, by whatever mechanism, happens to put more L in those formal activities, it's going to have these massive beyond Hulton effects that I was referring to. And maybe stuff like that explains the big firer-like estimates. I don't know. Another one that's, but there's been some progress highlighting exactly that mechanism, for example, in Vietnam by Nina Pavchnik and co-author, for example. Second one would be knowledge spillovers. One reason why those VMPLs could be different across activities is because one of them generates knowledge spillovers on others. That's a high VMPL in a sense, compared to maybe some other sector doesn't generate knowledge spillovers. Of course, evidence for knowledge spillovers is not sufficient in this. You need to have evidence that it's higher in some activities than others for the knowledge spillovers to be a source of these benefits. If they're just everywhere, then there's nothing that reallocation can make the effects of knowledge spillovers any better or worse. We have some great growing evidence about such spillovers from different examples, cross-country spillovers, learning by exporting it's sometimes called, cross-industry spillovers within locations in Mexico, for example, but a lot more to learn, as Eric mentioned too. Sometimes we just think that the distortions across firms, maybe in an industry, are really easy to predict because they just depend on size. By the way, I think if I polled you, you might think, oh, the big firms have the high value marginal product of labor, or some of you might say, no, it's the small firms have the really high marginal product of labor. It's maybe not so obvious. I'd love to know estimates of credit MPKs, but across the firm size distribution. If you know about that, please tell me. But anyway, for example, maybe market power is an easy one to think of. If you just think big firms have the market power, because they're big, then it's easy. It's like the covariance of VMPL with DLD trade is probably going to just be proportional to the covariance of VMPL with just L, the baseline size. And that's because we usually just think it's very true, very supported by lots of evidence, that trade tends to just stretch the firm size distribution, make big firms benefit more from trade shocks, basically. Okay, another example would be technology adoption. Of course, this per se is not an externality, but you might imagine that some of it has this public good aspect, that followers learn from the adoptions of others. So amazing evidence like Paula's on sort of tariff reduction causing increases in such adoption, or things like adoption, and that Eric talked about too, is kind of central if we think that those things have those knowledge spillovers and other activities that firms don't. Again, I'm not aware of evidence that's true, but it sounds plausible. Of course, there are internalities, to take the phrase from behavioral economics. Here, I'd talk about the internality of a firm that is, if it's not maximizing profit, I would call that a firm internality. Of course, that could happen for lots of reasons that Eric mentioned. Sometimes that gets called X inefficiency. So effects of trade on X inefficiency, like, for example, Nina Pavchnik's work, seminal work identified, is really important here. You can even think about teenagers making life choices, and maybe they're myopic in the way they're affected by short-term events, like David Atkin found in a trade context in Mexico. Finally, I sometimes think we look at the heavy and chemical goods industry of South Korea and just think there's something about manufacturing that is just special. And I don't know any evidence that this is true. For efficiency, maybe it's good for labor intensity, et cetera, but just for efficiency, maybe manufacturing has a higher VMPL than agriculture. or services. We discussed this earlier. I don't know why we would know that's true, but maybe it's true. And so if industrial policy, like in South Korea, did, as Nathan Lane's paper really nicely shows, did move capital and labor into those heavy chemical sectors, then it's good for South Korea. But unless you kind of know that the VMPL is higher there, you don't know for sure it's good. You know, they could have been some other sector that was targeted instead, and South Korea would have benefited just as much. So I sort of see it as a fascinating open question that relates to industrial policy we were discussing earlier. Okay, so finally, trade and inequality. So this is another area where it's a classic topic, obvious interest, been studied for a long time. This is a great Yale survey by Goldberg and Pavchnik in 2007. I'd say the amazing progress that's made on this in the last 20 years has been mostly focused on the pessimistic side of trade and inequality. So I put it in red, as if it's bad. This is like studying schools in Indonesia and only focusing on the poor local firms that can no longer hire child labor. You know, it's bad for them, school construction in Indonesia. But of course, we often write papers about the benefits of those things, like the kids who are now have education. But anyway, the negative side of trade, of course, is that import competition floods into your country when you open up, like, say, India or Brazil did in the early 90s. And that's, of course, going to be bad for anyone who's exposed to that, who's now import competing, both the capitalists and the laborers who are exposed. And we've had fantastic work that's highlighted exactly that. A great example of spatial research design, starting with the work of Topolova that I mentioned, continuing with the work here more with using employer-employee match data from Dix Cornero and Kovac, comparing regions of Brazil that, based on the pre-existing industrial composition, were exposed relatively to the tariff reductions that Brazil undertook. And the sort of amazing, slow-burning but persistent scarring effect that had on regions that's quite puzzling. Certainly not the Heckscher-Ohlin model that Bertil-Ohlin wrote down in the 30s or that I was taught in 2004. We've learned a ton from this very challenging evidence, I would say. However, you know, there are these three other effects of trade on the world, and they could be unequal, and so they could affect inequality. One is just export access. You know, that can be skill biased, as Eric's work showed, as we saw, but obviously this is just for good for anyone who happens to be in the export interacting sector. A second one that's yellow, because it's a bit more vague, is like importing inputs into firms. Of course, if those things are complements for the factors already inside the firms, that's going to be great for those firms. Of course, if it's substituting away from those workers, you know, if the imported parts displace the workers who used to make those parts, then it's bad for those people. And hence it's in yellow. Finally, just all consumers benefit from cheaper prices, but that itself could be heterogeneous, as for example, Amit's work has shown. Plus, of course, you feed all four of those through input-output linkages, and you get like indirect effects of all of those. So that's something I tried to do. I'll end on this, but that's something I've been trying to do with some co-authors in the context of Ecuador, drawing on these administrative data sets that were referred to earlier. So there's a bit too much going on here for you to maybe fully see it, but it's as if you can kind of, thanks to employer-employee match data, you can match, of course, workers to firms. And then thanks to like firm ownership registries, you can match owners to firms. You know, owners are kind of capitalists and human capitalists, you might say, that own firms, and they're the entrepreneurs. And we can match them too. And then thanks to value-added trade tax records, we can track firm-to-firm trade within the country. And then, of course, unfortunately now we can't match firms to individual consumers yet, where we and others are working on that elsewhere. But we map them to like an aggregate rep consumer. And so hence we're ignoring all those consumption effects of trade on inequality. Finally, we can match all the firms to the foreign world via standard custom transaction records that have been available for hundreds of years. You know, in some sense, we dream of this Foster 1922 article in the AER, where Foster, I think, was the first person to draw the circular flow of money in an AER article. We dream of his artistic talents as well as, of course, his vision that one could actually sort of try to measure the flows. Of course, the elephants in the room that you're all, I'm sure, are very aware of and worried about are like informality in the context of Ecuador. It's about half the workforce is in the informal sector. So we have to draw on other data sets to bring that in. Unfortunately, in kind of an anonymized way, it's much cruder. We tried our best. Of course, there's evasion, tax evasion. These are administrative data sets. You might worry that everything reported in them is fake. In follow-up papers studying evasion, measuring evasion, we've always sort of gone back and checked whether our trade conclusions here don't appear to be affected by the evasion we're finding. And so far, it's not. But you know, of course, I worry about that too. Anyway, what do we find? So the surprising thing that happened here is that I really thought that the way the world works is that rich people export. They might do it indirectly. You might be a lawyer that works for a firm. You don't export, but all your clients export. All your clients are like the oil firm in Ecuador. So I really thought that rich human capitalists and capitalists would be the beneficiaries of trade via exporting. That turned out to be exactly wrong. The beneficiaries of trade in Ecuador, we think, are the relatively rich. So these are sort of income effect plots, normalized so the median is 0, of export effects and import effects, and you add them and you get total. So it is kind of driven by labor and business income relative to total labor income, but it's and it's bigger at the top, so it's pro-rich, but not for the reason we thought. It's like all these firms in Ecuador that are importing intermediates and making more profits because of it. The people who own those firms are the gap between the red and the blue, and that middle figure to the right, they're the rich people who own those firms. And as you can see, a lot of the effect of trade on inequality is driven by that channel. Okay, so I've talked about 3 areas where I think rapid progress has been made. One is the vision of kind of intra and inter. The second is the question of whether we can explain and understand and maybe question the aggregate effect of trade on aggregate incomes, working via felicitous effects on reducing misallocation. And then finally, the sort of the spatial frictions within countries and how that's changed our picture of the incidence and the inequality effects. I'll stop there, but I've obviously omitted a bunch of important things. Maybe the one that deserves the biggest shout out is relative to discussions we've been having is interactions between trade and the environment. You might imagine that exactly the spatial interactions that I've been talking about here today in terms of movement of goods and people and capital is a plausibly important form of adaptation that may be important for how we think about climate challenges, amongst, of course, other issues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dave, for an insightful and rapidly, efficiently delivered paper. It is now my pleasure to invite Paula Bustos from the Center for Monetary and Financial Studies as our first respondent. Over to you.
Thanks. So first, thanks for the invitation to present here, and sorry that I missed the presentation so far. At least I could see Dave's presentation, which has been great. So we kind of coordinated to try not to overlap a lot on the topics we would discuss. So I'll just give a discussion of some of the same topics that David discussed, but sort of emphasizing some other aspects that were probably not emphasized. So in terms of an outline of which I think fits well with what David was discussing. 20 years ago, most of the literature was focusing on international trade and FDI. And then more recent work focuses on within-country trade and spatial frictions. That's my case. No, I was working on international trade, and I moved in this direction. This is a personal view on the literature, but my feeling is one of the reasons for this movement, in a sense, is the success of the empirical trade literature in the early 2000s. Showing that trade induces large productivity gains, but those are not always widely distributed. The more recent literature, I think, is trying to understand which are the frictions that prevent these productivity gains to reach a wide share of the population in developing countries. And a look at the recent evidence suggests that this is of special concern in regions with a comparative advantage in agriculture, such as Africa and Latin America. So I'll go a bit in more detail on that. So let me go over these points in a bit more detail. I think the clock is not working. Okay. Oh, okay, nice. Thanks. Okay, so first, in terms of the empirical trade literature, I'm sure Eric talked about it in the morning. I wasn't here. So I think something nice about this literature is that it took the theoretical mechanisms that were emphasized by the new trade theory or endogenous growth and tried to take them to the data and observe whether they were present in this data. Using product and firm level data that permit direct observation of the outcomes of interest and the mechanisms. And then a second characteristic of this literature is that it relied on exogenous changes in market size generated by trade liberalization episodes or other exogenous shocks that lend credibility to the estimation of causal effects. So I think the consensus view that emerged is that international trade leads to productivity gains. A first mechanism builds on this idea that trade reallocates market shares towards more productive firms that are exporters, and is related to this discussion by Dave on when is trade going to reallocate market shares to firms with high marginal product of labor or value of the marginal product of labor. So the justification in the framework that was used at the time, which is the model by Melitz, is that trade is an asymmetric shock for firms. Why? Because there are fixed costs of entering the export market. That means that only the most productive firms that are the larger firms are going to find it profitable to enter. This implies that in a symmetric, if you think of two symmetric countries, trade liberalization is going to be only import competition for the smaller firms that can't benefit from exporting, but the larger firms have both import competition and they can enter the export market. Why is this not a symmetric shock for these firms? Because when they enter the export market, they can sell the whole market, but they face import competition only from a fraction of the foreign firms. Oops. And this means that there is an increase in the market size for these firms that are exporters, and that permits them to expand their scale, and that's why there's going to be gains from this reallocation of market shares. So there's a few papers that looked at that in the data. The one that I think is better identified is the recent paper in Vietnam by McCaig and Pauschnik that uses a free trade agreement between the US and Vietnam that implied a very large reduction in tariffs from the point of view of Vietnamese firms. A second literature looked at within firms, what happened within firms. So this is about relocation, what happens within firms. And here, a finding is that export opportunities induces firms to upgrade quality, technology, and skills. The reason for this is, again, built on these models of monopolistic competition and fixed costs. Technology adoption costs are fixed. So as trade induces exporters to increase their scale, this is going to induce them to adopt these new technologies that have higher fixed costs and lower marginal costs and also are going to increase productivity. They have a positive effect in aggregate productivity because they're going to reduce the price index in the economy, which is the measure of welfare in these monopolistic competition models. On the import side, a paper I like a lot because it maps very nicely on the mechanisms in these endogenous growth models is a paper by Amit and co-authors looking at India, where they show that imports of new varieties increase product innovation by firms. And this is, a new growth theory had this expanding variety, growth through expanding variety, so that maps very nicely into that mechanism. At the same time, they find that this trade liberalization in India also increased markups as firms, had a reduction in input cost, but they didn't pass it on to consumers. So this raises the question of, to what extent these mechanisms documented at the firm level had positive effect on workers in developing countries, and maps very well into the last paper that David was discussing, where they are able to map that with the data from Ecuador. Okay, so let me give a bit of a history on these recent papers on trade and and worker welfare. The first few papers were using variation across sectors in trade policy, and they were finding small but negative effects, but very small. And this approach somehow missed GE effects because they were using variation across sectors, and when workers can move across sectors, wages are not going to be determined at the sector level. So a good innovation was brought by Topalova, who looked at these effects across different regions in India using the variation coming from the fact that different regions are specialized in different industries and then are going to have different exposure to import competition. And she found larger negative effects on rural workers. And Dix, Carniero, and Kovac, that was also discussed by Dave, found very large negative effects and persistent ones on wages and employment in Brazil. So here, I want to mention a couple of things about this literature. First is that most of these papers using this local labor market approach tested for the assumption by showing that these trade shocks had negative effects on wages but not on migration. And that suggests that there's very large spatial friction. So that's one big motivation for focusing on those spatial frictions and the agenda that Dave was reviewing. And then a second thing that I think is important about that agenda is about methods. So one of the well-known limitations of this methodology of doing differences and differences across regions is a missing intercept, but also the existence of spillovers across regions. And I think one of the very useful advances in Dave's work is what they propose in the paper with Hornbeck, that you can actually take into account those spillovers by incorporating a market access measure that in the analysis. And they do it for transport costs, but you can think of other sources of spillovers that you're worried about. You can also include them. We have worked with including capital market linkages, but you can also think about labor market linkages. There's a recent paper by Dix, Carniero, Kovac, and Buruziak showing how you can do that. And in practice, it seems that it's not going to be possible to separate these links through goods, labor, and capital market, but actually, at least in the data for Brazil, we have been working with that, and you can separate these empirically in the sense that adding these different terms doesn't affect estimates on the other terms. So there's enough richness in these links in the data that you can exploit that empirically to take care of those links. So I think that's something interesting methodologically about this literature. And then finally, on the trade and worker welfare literature, I wanted to mention a recent study that uses variation in trade policy across countries and time. This is a paper by Goldberg and Reed. And here what I think is kind of interesting is that they use a measure of trade policy or integration into world markets in the last 40 years using signatures of trade agreements. Of course, trade policy we know might be endogenous, but I think it's still worth looking at the data. And what they find basically is that integration into export market tends to be positively related to a reduction in poverty. But this reduction, episodes of sustained poverty reduction are often preceded by fast export growth, but not by agricultural productivity growth. So these, look at the cross-country data that they analyze suggests sort of something that, is probably well known, that most recent successful development cases are related to expansions in export markets and industrialization in East Asia, and places with a comparative advantage in agriculture didn't necessarily have these successful development path recently. This cross-country evidence lends some support to the classic idea that this transition from agriculture to manufacturing requires the adoption of some increasing returns technology that require a large market. So this is why these countries that integrate are able to transition into manufacturing and grow. But basically, economies with a comparative advantage in agriculture don't have the possibility of doing this type of path, because they will specialize in agriculture and import a manufacturing good, and this is an old Heck-Sherolin prediction. So this is the last thing I wanted to discuss. What is the path for this type of countries? We can think about Latin America or Africa, where there's a clear comparative advantage in natural resources or agriculture, and they cannot follow that path that has been followed by East Asian economies. There is one concern with lower growth. If not going into manufacturing implies you lose on the learning by doing externalities. If this sector is characterized by these learning by doing, and agriculture is not, and there's a famous paper by Kiminori Matsuyama making that argument. There's some recent paper by Reka Juhas showing one example. This is in France during the Napoleonic Wars, where some industries, she argues, that were characterized by this learning by doing and externalities and benefited from temporary protection. So that is one example of this mechanism, but there's very few, very little empirical work. If this is a concern, an implication is that you need to do some supply-side policies that shift comparative advantage, so as these sectors that employ more labor and have these external economies such as industry and traded services. And there's some recent literature looking at industrial policy, trying to understand, to what extent this is a good idea or not. So this is open for research, and interesting area for current research. A second concern with these economies is higher inequality. Why? Again, some work by Dave has shown that in Ethiopia and Nigeria, markups imply that most of the gains from trade go to intermediaries. And this is true especially in less competitive remote markets. So that affects agriculture more than industry. So that can be a source of higher inequality in areas with a comparative advantage in agriculture. And a second concern is that new agricultural technologies tend to be labor-saving. So in our work in Brazil, we found that income gains from productivity, income gains for adopting these new technologies were concentrated in the hands of landowners and did not have any effect on wages. So there were a very large increase in agricultural profits, but not on wages. So in this case, another thing to explore that I don't think has been explored much by the literature is demand-side policy. So in this type of context, to what extent redistribution of these gains from primary sectors can generate a middle class that can sustain a transition to manufacturing and services. And I think here, something interesting is that Latin American countries have implemented policies in this direction. In some cases have been massive, like the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil, but we don't know to what extent this had an effect on local demand for industry and services, and what are the development effects of this type of redistributive policies. In other countries like Argentina, they were much less successful. So I think this is another area for interesting work, to understand in which cases or in which ways these redistributive policies can, lead to sustained development or not. So hopefully some more work in these areas will bring some new consensus in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paula, for presenting us with several insights and more questions to explore. Our last respondent for the session is Amit Khanselwal from Yale University, whom I gladly invite.
So thanks. I also want to echo a point that Eric made at the beginning of the firm's conference, firm session, which is to thank the organizers for including trade into a conference, in a development conference. In fact, a question came up yesterday to me of whether trade was part of development. And it's always been kind of, my close development friends have always asked me that question over the years. But for someone like myself, I actually think that trade has been an integral part of development. I came out of a department that had a trade and development seminar. I took trade theory from T.N. Srinivasan. When I graduated from Yale, I went to Columbia, where I sat in the seminars by Ron Finlay. And Ron Finlay, who's an amazingly skilled international trade theorist who passed away last year, had an interesting quote in an interview of his, which is he took it upon himself as an international trade economist, when writing at the time of the 60s and the 70s, to integrate the ideas of Ricardo and comparative advantage with the ideas of Lewis. So for him, it was trade and development are intimately related. And then by the time I left Columbia, I was living in the same building as Jagdish Bhagwati, who of course is a titan in the trade and development field. And if any of you have ever had a conversation with Jagdish, you will know that he will regale you with stories of trade and development from the 60s and 70s as well. Okay, so I think this is something that I want to just emphasize on the point that Dave made, is that trade and development has a long history together. And one way to see that is to open up Anne Kruger's 1984 handbook chapter. And at the very beginning of that handbook chapter, she has this great quote which says, "Perhaps the issue central to the analysis of trade policies and development is the extent to which special circumstances in developing countries vitiate the usual free trade dicta." And it's actually a really nice way to think about the impact of trade and development, is to think about what are these special circumstances. And to her, the three special circumstances that she was writing about at the time were issues of externalities. She called them dynamic factors, but that was basically trying to think about under what situations is infant industry protection justified in a developing country and not. She was thinking about commodity prices in the terms of trade, so whether developing countries are in fact price takers on world markets, and if not, would specialization as dictated by Ricardo would lead to a decline in their terms of trade. And then the third thing that she wanted to emphasize, and which will be the point of where I'm going to kind of pick up on one point that Dave was trying to make, is the role of market failures or distortions and how they interact with trade. And it's been long known, and Dave kind of highlighted this, that in economies with distortions, anything can happen. Okay, so if you have an economy with market failures, and you open up to trade, then distortions could amplify the gains from trade if they're reallocating activity towards the distorted activity, but it could also reduce the gains from trade if it's reallocating activity away from the distorted transactions. And at the time, this led to a really large research program in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, kind of thinking about the ranking of policy instruments in developing countries, and to what extent free trade or trade policy should be used as a way to potentially address some of these distortions. And I think one of the key ideas that came out of that is that it's a second best policy. And in fact, if you have a distortion in an economy, you should be using an instrument that targets that particular distortion. And I think that this was really an important set of research. And whether you agree with free trade theories or not, you should at least as I stand in awe of kind of how the trade and development research program was very influential in reversing import substitution policies that had been adopted by low-income countries. And if you then fast forward 10 years, or roughly a decade, a little bit more, and Kruger in her 1997 AEA presidential address has a line that says, "The ideas with regard to trade policy and economic development are among those that have changed radically." And what she was reacting to was this picture, which just comes from Doug Irwin's recent paper, kind of charting the number of liberalization episodes we've seen post-World War II. And you can see that in the 1960s and 70s, there's kind of very few episodes of developing countries kind of expanding their openness, defined in various ways. But then we see this wave of multilateral, unilateral trade liberalizations opening up of the capital markets in the 80s and 90s. Okay, so where do we go from there? If you then think about where the trade research was in the 90s and 2000s, it, like lots of other fields in economics, starts to embrace the empirical revolution, as Dave alluded to. And now you're armed with kind of these trade liberalization episodes. You can go through countries that there's 15 to 20 countries where we have country-specific studies of the impacts of trade changing trade policy on particular outcomes. There's also an increased availability of household and firm-level data. And in particular, there starts to become kind of theoretical advances that are particularly well-suited for dealing with the heterogeneity that you face in empirical work. And in particular, I'm thinking about the Melitz model. And we saw kind of a really started an emergence of an active research program, which at that time, I sort of assessed this as an intense area of focus in two areas. One is on the performance of firms, and then the other area is on the extent to which these trade liberalization episodes kind of affected wages. And I'm not going to go through the long summary of those. I think a lot of that came out from both Dave's presentation, but as well as Eric's presentation. But we, in fact, did see a widening of income inequality in developing countries for a variety of mechanisms. And then I think one of the takeaways that I get from a lot of that work, during this time was that we generally saw improvements in firm performance. We learned that export market access is critical. We learned that, in fact, input market access is actually quite critical. And that was probably speaking something towards the changing nature of trade and how it's becoming more value chain oriented. But it also became clear at the time that measurement challenges are very, very complicated when thinking about firm performance. Okay, so this is something that Eric didn't actually go through. I thought he was going to spend more time on this, but his JEL article has a really great summary of all the measurement challenges that are confronting papers written at this time, and I wrote some of these as well. Where just think about the idea of kind of to extract a measure of productivity and linking it to trade reforms. And it's a little bit an unfortunate outcome of our profession that we place so much weight on something we can't observe, this measure of productivity. And so I think the literature kind of detoured a bit and thinking a little bit, kind of abstracting away from development and trade per se, but towards thinking about getting the measurement correct. And there were two ways to do this. One was try to think about better quality data to improve the measurement of productivity. The other was to do what Paula had done, for instance, in her job market paper, was to just use different measures of direct measures, such as technology adoption, number of products, and so forth, which might correlate better with productivity. Okay, now we then learned, I think, from this work that trade does have a large impact on the performance of firms in developing countries. But if I look back at that work, I think it's still a little bit of an open question as to why. And I think kind of that's the starting point of where I want to emphasize a little bit more. The special circumstances that Anne was writing about in 1984 were kind of underemphasized. And so, just to beat up on my own work a little bit, so I worked on India, and I found that during India's trade liberalization episode, there was an expansion of the number of products that domestic firms were producing as they got access to intermediate inputs. Now, if you think about that idea, it's not evident that that's an India-specific phenomenon. That could very well happen in the United States. And in fact, during the most recent trade war, where we've seen the opposite happen, when tariffs have gone up, we've seen that US firms have been hurt as a result of that. And so that's an example of something where we think that the directionality of trade may be magnified in a developing country context. It's further from the frontier in many respects. And so just as access to input markets in the US will benefit US firms, it'll benefit them even more in India. But it's not clear that from that correlation or causal evidence per se that the special circumstances are the source of those gains. There are some notable exceptions during this period to this. I think there were some early work on markups by Jim Levinson and Ann Harrison in Cote d'Ivoire and Turkey, thinking about the role of trade and markups, showing that there is a kind of decline in markups when you open up the trade. I think the work during the 2000s started to think about trade and labor markets and informality. Nina Pauschnick's and Penny Goldberg's work on trade in Colombia and the role of informality there, if you look back at that, it's actually very much pioneering and thinking about what's going to happen 10 years later in terms of the literature. But I think at the time they had a really tough time publishing those papers because I think the trade profession wasn't quite willing to kind of accept what is the role of informality. It's maybe not so important because they're coming from a bias of thinking about the US. That becomes even more stark if you think about labor mobility. So there was some work. So Petia's, Topalova's job market paper, I think, when she started writing that paper mid-2000s, and she actually faced a really hard time trying to convince people that labor mobility is really challenging in developing countries, and it's going to in a textbook way, lead to the responses that she found, but that wasn't willing to be accepted. And I think if you then fast forward 10 years beyond Petia's paper, I think that's a really good example of a development economist who came to look at trade from a development economist perspective and kind of convinced the trade audience that factor mobility is important. And it's now the central idea, I think, for understanding the impacts of the China shock on the US market. And then there was some work done by Nina Palchnik and Eric Edmonds on child labor at that time. Okay, but by and large, I think those special circumstances tended to be underemphasized. And this is where I think the recent work in the past 10 years or so is kind of really exciting. I won't go through this, but Dave emphasized there's a variety of reasons for why this is happening. There's just an expansion of administrative data, firm-level data, customs, firm-to-firm transactions, employer-employee data sets. There's papers using different ones. There's Dave's papers using all of them at once. Then there's also a set of papers that are trying to think about measurement. And they're doing that, I think, taking the hat of a development economist by writing tailored surveys to sort of track the outcome that you really want to measure. We're bringing in causal inference designs, but it is actually an area of work where there's a lot of interplay between getting causal estimates of parameters of interest and then trying to think about how you integrate them into quantitative models to run counterfactuals. So it's actually quite an exciting area. There's two areas in particular, and Dave mentioned this, and so I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about it, in which how we think about trade and development interacting with particular sets of distortions. And these are some ideas that David Atkin and I have worked on, and David Atkin in his paper with survey chapter with Dave have outlined as well, which is this is one channel through which trade will differ in a developing country relative to a developed country. So one way of kind of classifying these sets of distortions is to think about weak institutions. There is now an emergent literature thinking about or trying to measure tariff evasion. So a good paper in this realm is Sandra Sakaria's paper, job market paper, tracking bribe payments in Sierra Leone. And the reason that's important is it kind of speaks to two issues. So one is that she kind of argues that the tariff elasticities that we find, so how do tariff volumes react when tariffs change, tends to be smaller in developing countries, and tariff evasion might be one source of that. That number, of course, is critical, as Dave mentioned, in quantifying the gains from trade. And then the second reason has to do with if we think about industrial policy, which is that if there is, in fact, lots of tariff evasion, then the tariffs that are set in the national capitals but are not necessarily enforced in the borders is going to be, it's not necessarily going to implement the industrial policy you may be thinking about. We've learned a lot about the role of contracting and trade. So Chris Woodruff has done some work on this, Banerjee and Duflo, some early work on this as well. More recently, Rocco Macchiavelli and Amit Majoria have been working on the role of contracting and relational contracts in trade. Why is that important in trade? It's because we think that, and indeed it's been shown, that a lot of trade does in fact occur in value chains. And when trade tends to be done in value chains, it is often done through relation to specific investments. And so therefore, relational contracting becomes really important, because if you are a firm in a developing country and you don't have those relations, it becomes difficult to plug into those value chains. And that's, of course, a really big part of the path to development through trade that Paula was alluding to. We've seen papers on thinking about how trade interacts with regulatory enforcement. I think the cleanest and clearest evidence of this is Eric's recent paper, thinking about pollution havens. And there you get, in effect, a negative consequence of trade, which is that when Mexico accepts lead batteries, there's a health consequence in the Mexican market as a result. There's a whole set of distortions on factor markets. I won't go through all of them, but we briefly touched upon labor markets. There's some work on capital markets, so just thinking about the the framework that Paula laid out, if trade is costly and you need to raise capital in order to cover those fixed costs of trade, then obviously if you're in a market with capital constraints, it's going to be challenging. I think actually Eric will be presenting a paper at Yale in a couple weeks, trying to think exactly about the interplay between exports and capital markets in a randomized trial. Land markets is something that actually is kind of underemphasized, but is kind of, if you want to think about what is the factor market distortion there, I think we have kind of not so great evidence trying to think about the role of special economic zones and how important they are for trade. There's a little bit of work on that, but that's, I think, an area where there is some space for more work. And then another set of distortions, so weak institutions, factor market distortions, and firm distortions, are kind of thinking about size-dependent distortions. Okay, so there, the papers that were mentioned by Dave and by Paula, for example, Nina Pauchnik's work in Vietnam, showing that when Vietnam gets this market access export opportunity in the US, there's a shrinking of the informal sector, small businesses, and a reallocation towards formal businesses. And that is a good example of how trade's interacting and can actually magnify the gains from trade relative to a standard model. We also have evidence, for instance, of in India, of India's trade liberalization kind of leading to disproportionately more exit of informal firms in India as well. And then there is some work showing evidence of political connection. So in the context of China, when China was opened up to the WTO, we saw the role of the state-owned sector kind of decline. Okay, so these are examples in which trade will be, we think, kind of different, and the impacts in a developing country relative to a developed country. Okay, so that's one area. That's kind of in thinking about how trade interacts with distortions, holding the distortions fixed. But then I think an even more exciting area, which is smaller in sort of work, but where I think is really exciting, is to think about how trade changes the underlying distortion itself. And so given my time, I'll just emphasize two. So one is we've seen some work on workplace safety and the role that multinationals are playing in kind of changing and upgrading labor standards within developing countries. I'm thinking there about Laura Boudreau's work on workplace safety committees in Bangladesh. A really nice example of how trade can affect labor laws or labor mobility laws comes from China, and this is a paper that I published in Restat by UCLA student Lin Tian, where she shows that in the export provinces in China that got greater access to markets, those provinces start to change their regulatory treatment towards migration and start to relax the hukou policy. And that's actually a really nice way to kind of show the link between international trade and changing distortions. This is, if I have more time, I would talk more about learning effects that were kind of mentioned earlier, for example, in the paper on rugs that I wrote with David Atkin and David and Adam Osman, kind of highlight that trade there is kind of overcoming information friction by upgrading firms through learning process and knowledge spillovers. There's some work showing that trade will affect underlying distortions in terms of markups, sometimes going down, sometimes going up. There's recent job market papers, seems to be coming out of MIT in particular, looking at markdowns and the concentration of trade. When Brazil opened up to trade, there was an increase in concentration leading to an increase in markdowns of wages. And then there's actually a very nascent literature. I can think of one paper, but it seems kind of interesting, thinking about how trade kind of changes the value of political connections. And so that's another in the context of India. And so this is, I think, kind of an exciting area to think not just how trade interacts with underlying distortions, but how trade may actually affect some of these distortions itself. Okay, so I'll wrap up there. So I think the trade development and research program is actually coming kind of full circle. It's coming back towards emphasizing those special circumstances that Kruger was talking about, but with more, it's obviously more empirical, more attention to measurement, more attention to identifying the specific set of distortions in place, and then also, of course, addressing more current issues in trade, reemergence of industrial policy, global value chains, and then structural changes, as Paula was alluding to.
Thank you, Amit, for an equally insightful presentation. Now I have a question. Will you allow me to steal a little bit of your tea and coffee time for questions? Agree? Okay, so let me take a round of 3 questions, and then we see where we stand for time. Shall I look to the left first? Andreas?
Thank you. Andreas Freitag, Friedrich-Schiller University, Jena. I would like to know whether your results or the results you presented here would give rise to other normative conclusions about trade policy, the multilateral trade order. Is there anything new we should consider?
Thank you, Andreas. A second question? Yes. Okay. Ask for 1, I get 2. Thank you.
This is following up on the comment you made, Paula, about is manufacturing special and some more learning spillovers. Like, that seems just like such a first-order question to know what to be advising countries in terms of their industrial policy of like you need manufacturing. So I'm curious, like, what kind of research? Like, so someone said that's the first-order question I want to work on it. What would you tell someone to actually do in terms of an economics research paper? It doesn't have to be development economics.
So, 2 related questions. So first is on cultural affinities and trade. There seemed to be some interesting research on that, I think in the 80s by Melitz and others. The second one is geopolitics and colonial legacies, and which is becoming more relevant today given the rise of China, because there were some kind of preferential trade within Francophone countries, Anglophone countries, and now this has been disrupted quite radically recently by China, particularly in Africa. I just wanted to know if there are research in this area, what are the main kind of conclusions that has been drawn. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for those questions. I would now hand over to the panel to answer in any order you wish.
I was stupidly waiting for the mic, but just getting so used to this thing. Policy, Andreas. You're absolutely right. I just phrased it like completely, I think, generally as like, I wrote that thing, DL, trade, right? And it was as if something affects trade, and that's general. It's like whatever it is that's affecting trade, we need to know how it affects the L's inside that covariance weighted by the marginal products. But of course, optimal policy design would be like choosing how trade affects which L's. And of course, the simplest example of that would be like trade as industrial policy, going back to these questions where you would somehow know where the high VMPL activities are, and then somehow design trade policy, admittedly as a second best instrument, as Amit comments. Anyway, so I just wanted to clarify that everything I said it didn't explicitly mention policy, but that was entirely covered. But I personally think that like trade is just an unusual policy area where, like, for example, the United States has something like 10,000 different tariff lines in the legislation, and that's just so targeted that it's just so rife for political economy and like firms lobbying for their own special interests that like we have to just sort of fight against that and remind society that like on the whole, on average, like we're all behind some veil of ignorance probably going to benefit if we just reduce all those tariffs. So to be honest, I just think that's the most important message that needs to get out there that follows from the kinds of things we've been seeing. The specific tinkering with like, how do I design my nation's trade policy to get it in so that the L's go up in the high VMPL activities in my metaphor? I wouldn't know how to do that. I mean, to be honest, it's not even just, it's hard for 2 reasons. First, you have to know the VMPLs. 3 reasons. Second, you have to know how to get those firms to grow, as Erica alluded to, you might design policies you think will get them to use more R&D, but they won't. They'll just pretend, et cetera, et cetera. The targeting problem is rife in this policy area like it is in so many others. And then finally, there's all those indirect effects I talked about. I mean, the best way to expand a downstream sector might be to expand the upstream sector and all those complicated interactions. So I'd just be super skeptical of the ability to design policy, to be honest,
Thank you, Dave.
I can take Seema's question. So I guess I have a very specific answer to your question, which is I think we need more papers measuring services productivity. Services productivity is substantially more harder than even manufacturing productivity. But a good organizing framework might be a recent paper by my colleagues, Michael Peters and Fabrizio Zilbati, showing or arguing that services productivity, particularly in consumer services, not like the producer services like IT, but in India, consumer services, the productivity of those have grown rapidly, which actually gives a lot of optimism towards a service-led growth or non-manufacturing-led growth. The way that they do this is heavily structuralized, and then trying to think about kind of micro estimates of services productivity. But it's extremely hard. I was in India last year, and what's new in India, amongst many things, is that you can order from the train, you can order food to come when you're going to the next city an hour from now, and it'll come to you on the platform. Now the question is, how do you measure that productivity? It's extremely hard. But I actually think that tailored surveys is the way to go. So, if you can convincingly show that consumer services like, food delivery and all this is actually growing in terms of productivity, I think that would be I'm waiting for this paper to be written, I think.
Thank you, Amit. Paula, is there one of the questions you would like to tackle?
Yeah, no, about the Seema's question. So I think, one of the things that is shown in this paper in India is that this service growth benefits richer people. So that is one concern. I think one sort of this more classic development path, that all countries, go through this structural transformation process, and for some reason, it appears to generate a more equal development path. This is what this cross-country data that Goldberg and Reed are looking at suggest. And I think, I think we don't have a lot of evidence, causal evidence on this. There is this, this paper by Rekha Juhas, showing how, one particular industry at a period of time. So I think that's a good example of the type of research, looking for some natural experiment that for some reason expanded the industrial sector for exogenous reasons and looking at what happened there. There is some people studying industrial policy in East Asia, because there was a lot of industrial policy in East Asia. So I think that's another, Levchenko has, an agenda doing that. I think that's very interesting. Look at industrial policy episodes and see what happens, and when did they work well and when they didn't. I think we had like a big prior against, we were very scared about industrial policy for a long time, so we didn't even want to think about it, but the policy experiments are there to be studied. So I think that's something we are doing in Brazil is looking at, this episode of labor being pushed out of agriculture because of the adoption of labor-saving technologies into manufacturing, and looking at what happened with manufacturing productivity growth. And what we're finding there is that actually, because this inflow of labor was unskilled, this didn't have a positive effect on manufacturing productivity growth. So we're finding that, for example, in this case, it seems that increasing the location and level of work is not only like increasing the size of manufacturing, but you also need a skilled labor force, which was one of the classic things that we're documenting for these East Asian economies, this transition that was accompanied by skill, but increases in education. So that's one thing we are looking at now. But I think there's not a lot of work looking at these transitions between agriculture and manufacturing, and in which cases they led to more equality, more employment, in which cases they didn't. So.
Thank you, Paula. Would someone like to tackle the cultural linkages question, please?
Yeah, I got. Okay. So I guess Conrad's in the room, so he's worked on issues on FDI and ethnic similarity. So that might be a good reference. But yeah, I don't know. I think maybe I'll flag one paper that I've written that's a very narrow aspect of cultural affinity and this aspect of learning that I mentioned, which is we ran a study trying to evaluate the efficacies of Burma's Myanmar's special economic zone, and what we realized in this process of lots of piloting was that there's just like a very basic and obvious friction towards learning, which is that the foreign managers at the zone, which are typically Japanese, and the Burmese middle managers don't speak the same language. They're all communicating via English, and since the Burmese managers in particular didn't know English very well, they're communicating via Google Translate, and that's not a very effective way to run a factory. And so then, a very basic idea would be to try to improve the communication through language training, for example. And so that's like a very microcosm aspect of how cultural affinity or some kind of measure of affinity, in this case language, linguistic affinity, can improve the flow of information. But it doesn't speak to the bigger question, I think, that you're kind of going after.
Thank you, Amit. We are now truly out of time for this session. Would you kindly join me in thanking our panelists for excellent contributions? Thank you so much. We have a coffee break. We are to be back for the panel at 3:15. Thank you so much.